Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
People don't even have like a do what, they don't have hobbies the way that they used to. They don't have families that they want to raise. Like maybe they have a dog, but you can't walk your dog all day, every day. So it's not even to the point where, people wish that like you could just automate politics so that they could get on with their rich and rewarding private lives. They don't have rich and rewarding private lives. They're staring down in the abyss. And they simply don't trust anyone to make good decisions and to turn those good decisions into good policies. They've been convinced that all of the problems that we face are so large, they're global problems that can't be solved by even an autocratic government.
Welcome once again to the Roundtable, the official podcast of the American Mind editors and publisher. Once again, you're stuck with me because Ryan's out. Our Lincoln Fellowship is currently ongoing, which means that many of us, including Matt Peterson, who is here today, are engaged in teaching the leaders on the right. So we're very grateful for that, but it does mean that it's me again hosting the show. I am joined by the rest of the crew, by managing editor Seth Barron, by executive editor James Poulos, back from book leave, and by founding editor Matt Peterson. So it's the whole gang except for Ryan, and we'll just have to tell him that it was the best episode ever, and he missed it, and he'll have FOMO forever. We've got a lot to talk about today, and we're going to start with this little kind of saga. It's almost like a morality play or an object lesson about Tucker Carlson's trip to Hungary. The basics of this are pretty straightforward. Tucker Carlson, huge host of a show, a Fox News show, widely watched, gets great ratings, and also one of the kind of only, I think, forthright and honest voices that is, a major figure, even on the American right. He's remarkable for his straightforward and forward-thinking attitude toward our current crisis. He went over to Hungary to kind of meet with Viktor Orban, who's the prime minister there, has drawn a lot of attention for his sort of family-friendly policies, for his for a whole number of things, as we will get into. But he's a self-described Christian Democrat, the Christian Democratic Orban. Here's an excerpt just from something Carlson said during his visit. He says, "Dehumanizing is the act of convincing people that they don't matter, that they are less significant than the larger whole, that they are not distinct souls, that they are not unique, that they are not created by God, that they are merely putty in the hands of some larger force that they must obey." Miles van der Rohe architecture, he's talking about architecture in the two countries in Hungary versus America, was designed to send that message not to uplift but to oppress. And it is very noticeable, and this is never noticed in the United States, which unfortunately over time has had its aesthetic sense dulled. We've been told it's not important. What matters is GDP, really, get the next new microwave or whatever, the new car, the new place in Aspen. And then Fox News reports, in contrast, Hungarian and Central European architecture is essentially a lesson to the West of how good Americans have it, to the point that they don't understand or can't fathom the world across the oceans from them. So this is a really remarkable set of comments, and the whole trip was filled with sort of striking moments. Carlson is putting his finger on something that everybody, I think, senses, who has eyes to see. Everybody is feeling this kind of looming attitude of authoritarianism and looking to places like Eastern Europe. But Carlson is talking about it at an aesthetic level. He's talking about it at actually a pretty high intellectual level while reaching an enormous audience. The domesticated right and the left, which is basically becoming the same thing, went absolutely nuts. I mean, for days on Twitter, it was like the only thing you could see were descriptions of how this is basically the right allying itself, the American right allies itself with European authoritarianism. Here's a CNN analysis. Tucker Carlson's pilgrimage to Hungary shows the right's evolution into authoritarianism. Hungary is no model for the American right, writes our favorite guy, David French at the Dispatch, at the Atlantic. Tucker Carlson's self-loathing international tourism. David Frum went on a rant about it. And it's all about how evil and terrible and authoritarian Hungary is and how Tucker's an authoritarian for going over there. I particularly liked this introduction from the CNN piece. I am just as tired of writing about Tucker Carlson as I am sure you are of reading about him. That's almost a trope of kind of second-rate online journalism, but it's also, I think, extremely telling for this guy, Oliver Darcy, to be saying, oh, I wish that I didn't have to talk about Tucker Carlson, but he's so much more famous and influential than I am, and also I actually love to make an enemy out of him. The whole thing just sort of speaks to the dynamics of our kind of broken and dysfunctional culture at the moment. So we wanted to bring it up, do a little retrospective, and I'll turn it over now to the guys to say, what did we learn from this whole thing?
Well, I think it's very interesting. And what it reminds me most of is Trump's visit to Poland a few years ago and his speech written by Stephen Miller in praise of Polish determination, steadfastness, the fact that Poland has traditionally been hemmed in by enemies from both sides and has retained a sense of itself as a nation and a people. That it's always had this connection to, say, France and England, sort of sentimental connection. And he praised the Polish spirit, and he got the same reaction, basically, that Trump was praising a incipient fascism, ethno-nationalism, racism. And really what the whole thing comes down to is this loathing of the Eastern and Central European nations that have not given in to the Angela Merkel, March of the Millions. This idea that it's the duty of Europe to turn itself over to migrants from the South and make way for them. And countries that are not on this have not received the memo or gotten up hip to the agenda are just, it's just inexorable. They hate them. So whether or not, Orban is a fascist or whatever, it doesn't matter, because not permitting migrants into your country is the definition of fascism. So it's a very interesting kind of proxy war, I think, for what's going on in the US between the people who imagine that we're still a nation with borders and those who see that as just some kind of quaint, annoying fetish. So that's my take.
Yeah, I find that incredibly astute. I mean, another common thread between those two events is, as I kind of highlighted with the Carlson remarks, but also in the speech in Warsaw, Seth, there was that was one of Trump's best moments, I thought, in Poland, and there too, there was this linkage between the issue of immigration, which, as you say, is really just about whether we are a nation, to some of the more fundamental questions of political philosophy that we like to talk about at the American Mind, right? That these are not just questions about that they don't have to do with prejudice. It's got nothing to do with some just atavistic tribalism or anti-foreigner sentiment, but just at a foundational level, question whether you can decide who comes in and out of your country, or rather who comes into your country, I should say. Question whether you can decide who comes into your country is a fundamental expression of whether you think you have a right to organize yourself politically and to have sovereignty over the territory that you occupy. And that actually undergirds all of the other stuff that we would then kind of celebrate as aspects of a culture, or you might even say, a regime in the kind of classical sense. I mean, here's Trump from that speech. He says, our own fight for the West does not begin on the battlefield. It begins with our minds, our wills, and our souls. Today, the ties that unite our civilization are no less vital and demand no less defense than that bare shred of land on which the hope of Poland once totally rested. Our freedom, our civilization, and our survival depend on these bonds of history, culture, and memory. He strikes similar notes later on in front of Mount Rushmore, but I think it's telling that this is really, ultimately what we are up against is a regime, as you say, Seth, that detests the whole notion that people who are European, people who maybe are predominantly white, should be allowed even to enjoy and celebrate the fact of their mere existence. And the rage about Orban has nothing to do with, all the stuff that people raise, the corruption, the whatever that they point to, but actually everything to do with just the fact of asserting yourself as a nation with a right to perpetuate itself and continue to exist.
Yeah, I think the word soul is important. A lot of this criticism and this kind of criticism is coming from people who probably, if they were cornered at a cocktail party after 2 or 3 gin and tonics, they would admit that they really don't believe that human beings have souls. These are materialists. These are people who think that science is really reducible to mathematics, and that mathematics can explain everything about being human. And so for me, like, a lot of this is just a matter of standing. If you are out there making apologies for China, envious of China, if only we could be China for a day, bought and paid for by China, collaborating with China on gain of function research that should not be undertaken, much less in secret, then you simply lack standing, in my opinion, to complain about who says what with Viktor Orban. If you follow that same pattern with regard to the Biden administration, the eviction moratorium, probably can't be extended because of the Constitution, but we're just going to do it anyway. Military-industrial complex without limits, intelligence community running basically a government within a government that can never be restrained or affected in any way by quote unquote our democracy. That the autocrats of that sort simply lack the standing to complain about who flies on which airplanes to which Central American countries to have conversations. I find it to be ludicrous, and I think deep down they know that it's ludicrous too. They're flailing, and they're looking to squeeze a little more juice out of the sort of nastiest slurs in the box. And guess what? It's not working. Nobody cares. Like CNN's numbers are crashing, MSNBC's numbers crashing, and the regime is destroying, just shredding its credibility, making these allegations through its proxies. It's becoming predictable, and it's becoming quite hollow, and it is absolutely useless to any American trying to figure out how they can forge ahead in these times. So it's natural that it would get tuned out.
Yeah, it's one of these revelatory moments. I think for a lot of people who are still kind of not paying attention, they're concerned on the right, but they don't see, they're back and forth about Trump. They're good people. There was a day when 10 years ago, those people would have said, "What the hell is this? This is a terrible thing." And now every action that they take rhetorically against the right, every action kind of the mainstream media takes, it just seems to reveal their own hypocrisy in some way. And again, hypocrisy is only goes so far. The whole point is they're just trying to psyop the whole nation, but it becomes more and more apparent. And I just thought it was delicious. With Hungary, the whole idea, you're going to talk about corruption. Almost every tweet that was indignant about this and castigating Hungary for X, that same X could be applied to the United States in spades. So as James said, you're going to talk about cavorting with authoritarian nations. We have billionaires openly who have half of their billions in China, openly and corporations as well who are doing things that China they shouldn't be doing, who just brag about it. It's great, it's fine, and we should be in fact more like China, and China's not that bad. There's no credibility. And when it comes to corruption, especially, that word I think is important. What are you even talking about, right? The line was, well, Viktor Orban gave his family, contracts and jobs. I mean, the governor of New York until recently and the governor of California before the last one were both the sons of governors. I mean, Hunter Biden is selling his paintings. I mean, these people are above the law. Nothing's going to. There's no consequence. Nothing can happen to them unless some elite faction goes after them. And increasingly, this illusion that that we live in this Republican form of government in many of these states is disappearing. And the more that they complain, the more that they throw these old-fashioned attacks that don't recognize the new framework of the moment. The more they do that, the more they look silly and they diminish themselves. And the more they wake people up towards the right to kind of see what's going on in reality. In other words, like the rhetoric that they're throwing comes from a framework that does not correspond to reality. So it becomes cringe. It seems disjointed. The hypocrisy is revealed. And Trump did this over and over again. And you see them continuing to do it. And every time they do it, it actually, they just like James is saying, they weaken their position and their power. And, the real play for them would be a kind of rhetoric that acknowledges the moment and the reality of the landscape as it is, which is why the hard left is gaining. But this kind of stuff, it's like hollowing out the normie midwit middle class. It's the more they throw it, the more mid the wits get, and the more radicalized people on both sides become.
Okay, this is a really useful framing, I think, for talking about these two governors, Matt, whom you mentioned. Obviously, Andrew Cuomo stepped down, shocking some people, shocking me a little bit. I mean, I thought he was going to ride this out, this sexual harassment scandal, but Letitia James, the Attorney General, just really got him. And so now he's out. Newsom is up for recall September 14th. We've been tracking this. And he just went on this funny little rant. He was doing a video interview with a bunch of media outlets. The Sacramento Bee was probably the most notable one. And he just starts to froth at the mouth about this stuff. He says, I love this damn state. We have over 100 damn IPOs. Middle-class families in Texas pay more taxes than middle-class families in California. Look it up. That's a fact. I mean, there's a real indignancy here that was, it certainly seems as if he's starting to feel the heat a little bit. His poll numbers are not good. He doesn't have this as locked down as perhaps he thought he did. And there's, an attempt, I think, to use the Delta variant stuff to kind of alter the rules of this election, the way the coronavirus in general was used in 2020. But above all, it strikes me, Matt, as you're talking, that this is an example of the kind of cratering ruling class eating itself alive. I mean, this is the media and the leadership kind of at odds with eating each other because they're running out of Tucker Carlson's and Donald Trump's to dine out on. As James was indicating, it was easy for them to sort of keep the ship afloat while they could point to the big nasties of the evil fascists over there and over here. Now those are increasingly gone. That there's diminishing marginal returns to that kind of narrative, that thing to point to. And the numbers show it. The ratings are plummeting. Newsom's worried, it seems, about this recall. Should we be white-pilled about this? What do you guys think? Or is this just kind of, more dysfunction on display, but not actually going to lead to anything? How hopeful are you that Newsom really is kind of worried?
Well, I can't really speak to Newsom, but I do want to push back a little bit on some of the things you said about Cuomo, if I may.
Oh, yeah.
Cuomo, my read on Cuomo is that the sex allegations are smoke. It's a screen. The real problem with Cuomo is that he was so heavily lauded and became kind of the foil to Trump for the COVID crisis, which it emerged, he actually is responsible for 15,000 people dying. So it was a botched response. But here's the thing, it's the same response that a lot of Democrats favored and a lot of Democrat governors, and they need to get rid of Cuomo without making it about that. So when that finally comes back, they can say, oh yeah, that's another bad thing he did. Remember him? you see what I'm saying? That in a sense, he was elevated as like, okay, you had Trump and then Cuomo. And I always thought it was funny. They're both like these, they're both from the same neighborhood in Queens. They're both the sons of very dominant fathers. They're sort of doppelgangers in a way. And, they sort of became presented as heroic doubles.
Yeah.
But, in this Girardian sense, once Trump was moved aside, well, then Cuomo went from being the hero to he became the scapegoat. So he's had to take on the sins of the Democrats' failed COVID response. But in this, kind of massive denial. So they've concocted this, really bizarre set of accusations of, a lot of which are absurd. Like during a photo op, he was standing there with this dowdy doctor lady who was sticking a Q-tip up his nose. She was outfitted in surgical gear and a face mask. And he said, "Oh, you make that look good. You make that outfit look good." Now, the idea that qualifies as sexual harassment is just risible. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So they just had to pile on all of these absurd things. He's still the governor. He didn't step down. He gave 2 weeks notice, which is, again, totally bizarre and preposterous, and just another sign of how degraded and weird New York politics are. So I don't know even if that's like pushing back or not.
No, it's really interesting.
I would say it's a complicated dance going on, but it does lead to this. It does feed into what you were saying about the left eating itself, because, okay, they're going to get rid of him, but still they're lowering the bar of what qualifies as New York politicians are notoriously sleazy and lascivious. So if they're really going to say, "Oh, you patted someone on the arm, you need to quit," they're setting a weird standard for themselves. Is all I'm saying.
Yeah, well, I liked his Italian defense. I'm just Italian. I'm just affectionate, But yeah, no, this is really interesting. You're saying essentially that there's an elaborate form of memory holding going on here, where the fact that he killed your grandma is sort of eclipsed by this weird scandal. I agree that a lot of the allegations in that report are like, kind of, they're heavily Me Too inflected. Let's put it that way, right? They come with this kind of new ethos of how men and women are supposed to behave in the workplace, namely that men are basically on notice for anything they do, while at the same time describing some other behavior which did kind of sound creepy and gross to me. All of it was kind of like just ick factor, if that. And yeah, I wonder, now they've got this woman, right? Kathy Hochul. I'm not sure how to say it. Hochul. Yeah. What's her deal? She seems sort of like she's gonna just sail in and be like, yes, girl power. Now the narrative will be like, well, it's time for women to take charge, lean in, or something.
No, well, she's a cipher. She's like a non-entity who was nominated to be lieutenant governor just because he needed a woman to deflect a primary challenge. So, but she's going to get steamrolled by a far left legislature that is probably going to push New York closer to the California model, if not beyond. So it's not going to be good. She'll only be in for a year and a half at most, and then she will likely not win election, and she'll just disappear. She's not going to matter.
Well, this is really the lesson of the internet, as I've said, I guess, for long enough now that I feel old saying it, which is everyone is expendable. It is, we saw this with Al Franken. He just got zapped, and people can just easily get zapped, and people even at the very, very top are more interchangeable than ever. And so power flows toward teams, toward squads, toward tribes, toward gangs, toward juntas, use whatever terminology you want, all of these configurations of power become much more significant, and and even huge national figure. I mean, the story about Cuomo's COVID memoir or whatever it was, costing over $1 million to purchase, and now it's just going to be pulped. I mean, no one is safe, and Gavin Newsom is not safe either. The recall was supposed to be impossible, even just getting it on the ballot. Then, of course, it got on the ballot. And, one reason why these guys are flailing so hard, but yet also seem to just ultimately not have any ability to cling to power, they're so easily swept aside, is because it is such a jump ball and the situation is so fluid. Newsom had the biggest bluest state in the nation. He had a not totally, but largely cooperative legislature, and an opportunity to, quote unquote, do big things. And really nothing. I mean, what does Newsom have to show for himself? Tech is booming, and it's the only thing in California that is moving the needle in any way. And that all by itself, suggests to me that at a time when people are supposedly looking for leadership, it really takes some kind of incredibly heroic effort to distinguish yourself as a statesman in America today. This is the story of the Biden administration. This guy is the most warmed over individual possible on the bench that they could have pumped up and put at the top of the pile, and that's what they did. And he can hang as many portraits of Franklin Roosevelt in his Oval Office as he wants, and it's just so achingly clear that there is no heir to Franklin Roosevelt in the Democratic Party. And I think one reason why Trump made such a stir is because he was actually able to move minds and move bodies and change the political landscape through sheer force of personality and through political will. That is increasingly rare, and it's going to be interesting to see if anyone under the age of 40 or 50 even can match that kind of power of personality and capability of actual leadership. And even for Trump, it's beyond dispute that the guy was not a hugely successful statesman in the classical sense. I mean, his first political job was president of the United States. It's just a matter of public record that how many factions there are sort of struggling for power. It's just a big struggle. It's mud wrestling, and it's mud wrestling, I think, as far as the eye can see, unless someone is capable of stepping up in a major way.
It's fascinating the way you just put it. I mean, there's a lot we should unpack in the time we have, I think. I mean, look, as James was saying before we started, I mean, the desperation, first off, is what you notice, and it's hilarious and delicious. I loved every second of seeing King Gavin squirm. You could see, as everyone commented, it was getting to him. And the underlying assumption was, how dare anyone even, give a semblance of journalism, throw out some obvious facts about how California is failing its people, even as 20 years it's been bleeding out productive citizens who are leaving the state. And then we were all talking before we started recording about how also, right, Gavin had memorized all these facts. I mean, Seth pointed out, and it's clear, like, the psychological, right, defense. It's defensive. He's got to recount his story about how it's really successful, and no one believes that. Not a single person actually believes that everything is going well in California. That's laughable. People are leaving by the millions. Productive citizens are getting the hell out. There's some wealthy people doing very well. Tech is at the top. It's not trickling down. And the trickle down economics of Gavin Newsom is interesting. And in the meantime, you're growing up a large and increasingly violent underclass that they're actively cultivating. And look, I mean, it's great to see him squirm. I have to admit, I watched it twice because I enjoyed it. But there is a deeper problem here. And one way to put it is that with both Cuomo and with, I mean, let's just talk about this, right? I mean, both Cuomo and Gavin Newsom, we should say, are white males. And there is something about the power or the energy on the left, which would say these are not the people we want to represent us, right? I mean, the actual driving force intellectually and culturally for the left would reject them on that basis alone, that you should not have a white male in charge of a large entity. We need to get beyond that, and their privilege is showing, right? And in a way, I mean, reverse it. I think Newsom especially and Cuomo, they were both very serious contenders for the throne. And in Cuomo's case especially, there are other people who don't want him, don't want to contend with him. In Newsom's case, I mean, you see this tension. It's written everywhere throughout American society, especially in the urban centers on the left. When you just look at what in the Democratic Party, there's this tension between the woke ascendancy and the old school political machines and cartels that have usually run large democratic states and large urban areas. And the difference is, right, I mean, no one thinks that Cuomo in his heart of hearts is actually very woke at all. And he is a classic sort of mob machine boss. Maybe he, gives lip service to some of this stuff. Maybe he kind of believes it, but his life is about ruling in the old democratic way. And on the other side, you have, people, the cultural movement, the energetic intellectual movement that is on the left that props up figures like AOC. You see this with Lightfoot taking over after Rahm Emanuel was there, and her and the Soros DA really overpowering even the black police chief, who said a lot of good things when there was the famous hoax that occurred there. I mean, so you see this tension over and over again, though. What's happening is, and this is why I think people on the right shouldn't be too excited about all these developments. What's happening is these older people who represent the older way are getting pushed aside. So make no mistake, like, it's going to get worse. Seth just predicted that in New York. I think the odds of getting rid of Newsom are slim to none. But even if you did, what is going to ascend from the one-party state is something that's even woker and worse. And I'll just end with this. I mean, what's curious to me, what James said is, think about also how that old machine way depended upon the kind of leadership, right, that you were just saying doesn't exist anymore. And maybe in a certain way, digital dissolves, whereas the power comes from a kind of Borg, right, a bunch of bots, a swarm, the groups, and that's the wokeness. It can operate as a kind of group. And even on the right, you see where the energy is, it's more in bands of brothers in the gangs. And the old way of having that mobster on top, it increasingly does seem just untenable. And so, on we hurdle, I guess.
There's a essay, the cover essay in the new Claremont Review of Books is by Bill Vogel, and it's about crime. And Vogel points out that, it's impossible to run a pro-crime campaign, but the left has also made it impossible for itself to condemn criminals. And he dredges up this amazing story about a fellow, a white guy in the suburbs who gets mugged. And I think they steal his car. And he afterwards reports his deep regret that he called the police, because really he just wanted to help these guys, right? I mean, a level of sort of, self-effacement and virtue signaling that amounts to suicidality, right? That amounts to, I shouldn't have a right to be safe in my physical space. I shouldn't have a right to walk the streets without fear, right? What should happen is simply criminals should overrun my neighborhood. They should overrun my city, and so there's a segment of the voting population, however, small or fringe, that has now basically been talked into rolling over and just letting this stuff happen because it would be mean to do anything otherwise. And I find it, Matt, really kind of stunning and riveting in a grim sort of way to watch my classmates, many of them white males from, elite institutions, like, to watch old Yaleys, like, gradually come to realize that the party or the sources of their power, where they would previously have been kind of comfortably sinecured, are passing them by culturally. Meanwhile, Cory Bush is getting caught out saying things like, I'm going to pay $200,000 for personal security, but we're also going to defund the police. And even for me to use the verb caught out is to give myself away as an evil white supremacist, because it turns out that this is a perfectly fine thing to say according to the kind of new mania. And yeah, I guess the fear, I can see the fear in these guys' eyes as they realize that there just actually isn't a place for them in the new world, in the new left, except to roll over and be replaced. And that is a remarkable kind of neurosis to watch play out, especially among people who formerly hold a tremendous amount of power. I mean, it would be one thing if this was a kind of like, basically a fight between the inmates in the insane asylum, but it's, Congress people and governors doing this in front of our eyes. One shudders to think, what the rest of the world is watching and thinking, what China is watching and thinking, but nevertheless, like it does seem pretty plain that, Matt, what you described is exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, do we think that there's going to be any holdouts? I mean, there's a certain inexorable logic to this that you really can't have a white male. I mean, it's just kind of a simple concept as your front runner or leader, and that's the whole Biden play. Like, well, we just need Biden now, right, as the face of this. But on the other end, to what James is saying, though, the problem is they don't have any other leader who's really popular. Everyone is falling apart. And so where is their, whatever it is for them, it has to be some certain mix of race and identity and whatever. I mean, who among them is actually going to take the banner forward? And not to say everything's hunky-dory for the right, but there is this problem where by their own logic, they get rid of a lot of candidates. And then we're entering a time in which, and the candidates they prefer aren't popular. And you're entering a time in which it's almost impossible to conceive of the kind of leader we need. And that just might be a psychological trick of, how terrible our ruling class is. But I really think something about what James is saying is correct. Like, we're entering a time in which, that old kind of leadership, I mean, maybe that has to look completely different in order for things to work in the future. And what everyone is, I think, should be focused on now is community, right? People are moving because they want to find other people like themselves. People are building all kinds of communities, whichever side they're on. And there's something very interesting about the flow of power in this more decentralized maybe environment. But I don't know how far that goes. I mean, maybe I'm off here. But I mean, do they have who is their strongest lead on the left?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, you got AOC out there, I guess, but for so many Americans now, and especially the younger ones, there isn't really like an identity of the citizen that is relevant or that appears anywhere in their lives. The lesson that many people are learning from the slow rolling and now accelerating catastrophe of the past 20 odd years is that, well, politics doesn't work. Like, I don't want to go to town hall meetings. The county commissioners are all corrupt. Politics at the state level, like you can't really get anything done, and they try to implement big policies and it never really works out that well. And then you got these governors who are these old white males anyway, and all the way up the chain. There's a real crisis of confidence in politics as such. And it's not surprising that, that same kind of energy is leading to like, well, obviously human beings just can't be trusted to govern themselves. And so we just have to it's not just a matter of like, oh, let's give away, I'm surrendering my responsibilities to these machines so that I can, sit around and do what exactly? People don't even have like a do what, they don't have hobbies the way that they used to. They don't have families that they want to raise. Like, maybe they have a dog, but you can't walk your dog all day, every day. So it's not even to the point where, you know, people wish that like you could just automate politics so that they could get on with their rich and rewarding private lives. They don't have rich and rewarding private lives. They're staring down in the abyss, and they simply don't trust anyone to make good decisions and to turn those good decisions into good policies. They've been convinced that all of the problems that we face are so large, they're global problems that can't be solved by even an autocratic government, you know, even by a sort of dictatorial, you know, mastermind. Much less by, you know, well, we'll just have a vote. There's a real crisis of faith in politics of any kind, I think. And, you know, the hollowness at the heart of so many people's lives after these decades of just getting worn down raises some serious questions about, you know, whether they actually feel confident enough in leadership at all to seek out and reward even like an AOC, like a highly ambitious sort of younger person who at the end of the day is ultimately still just playing in that, you know, in that established political sandbox. You know, I would hope that this would open up real vistas of opportunity for like Matt, you suggested, communities of Americans who are like, well, you know, we're actually not done yet. You know, we actually do have sort of rich and rewarding lives, and yeah, sometimes it's tough, and life has its ups and downs, and you got to pull together with those around you, and you actually like love your family and know your neighbors, and on and on. And for people who have that kind of, you know, sort of a cultural reserves, resources to draw on, there's probably going to be a lot of room for folks to step up and take leadership positions in places where, you know, where community really exists. Until and unless that happens, I mean, I think a lot of, you know, the anti political sentiment has been reinforced by, you know, again, generations of elites whose response to the problems of, you know, of the neighbor that go all the way back to the Ten Commandments, you know, their solution was to just make the neighbor obsolete, to just break all of the sort of civic bonds that hold Americans together. And now, you know, it's catching up with them, and their role at the top of the heap just doesn't make sense the way that it used to.
The thing is, though, I'm not sure the left needs leaders because they own politics. They own the system. So I feel like it's like Biden. He's just a front man. It doesn't really matter. And like, you know what? They could probably make Kamala Harris president, even though nobody likes her. And that wouldn't matter either. It's like it's like, you know, in Mexico when the PRI was in charge for 75 years. It's not a question of who the populace likes. It's who the party insiders chose. Like, we're past the politics of preference in that sense. So in a way that or like, you know, when Chernyenko became premier, like, was he the popular guy? Was Andropov really like the voice, the herald of the tribune of the people? Or was it just, okay, this is who the Politburo has decided? I kind of feel like that's the way left politics is now. I feel like we're the ones who need a real leader. But maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think that's pretty wise. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that what people are slowly waking up to, and if it sounds radical, I just encourage you to think about it. When you look around, is what politics of preference, or otherwise known as Democratic or Republican form of government. I mean, does it matter what the people think? I mean, so exactly, AOC may not even be, she's not really that inspiring to a generation in the way that, say, FDR was, but she serves a purpose, and she's a useful, you know, face, a useful, you know, mask to move for the actual powers to move things forward. And it just feels that way in every part of American life, and this is why the concept of citizenship is being lost. And so I completely agree. I mean, why don't a lot of people vote, you know, in urban areas? Because they don't think it matters. And you know what? They're right. It doesn't matter. They've had one party rule for a long time. There's choke points that are controlled by elites. The only way you get kicked out of the cool club is if another elite faction fights you off. And they do that because pretty much everything's illegal and they're all pretty terrible people anyway. So you can, but you still have some moral sense in the country. So every once in a while, someone will get dinged for, violating some law or sexual harassment or doing something that there a whole lot of them do. But you have an easy way to off people when you gang together. And at the end of the day, like that's California, that's New York, that's Illinois. And increasingly you wonder if that is that the United States of America. And so I absolutely agree. I think that's exactly what's happening. It doesn't seem to matter, right, in a one-party state who rules. Now, on the other hand, what you said about our side is right. We still need leaders in a way more because we don't own the system. And I just would end on the one silver lining. I'd say that I do see signs that people who have something going on in their lives, have a sense of purpose, and don't want to die, don't want to live this way. I see those people every day now, both in their communities, places they've moved to, taking evasive action, right? Actually getting engaged in politics in a very real way, in a local way. And that quantum pill, that's both good and bad. That might mean it's just the time before the end. But you do see something very different going on there where people are really focused on building up community in some way. And it's almost the opposite of kind of let's call it, for the ancient Greeks would call it the Persian Xerxes model of the left, but now they don't even need a Xerxes. You just need some painted faces and the powers that be, hum on in the background.
Well, I mean, just look at like who likes and doesn't like Ron DeSantis, right, out in Florida with all this COVID stuff. DeSantis stands up and gives a speech. I guess it was last week, right? That if Biden tries to lock us down, I'm standing between Biden and the people. That's a form of leadership, and that's certainly, I think, like one of the like key wish list items for conservatives right now in a leader is who is going to put his foot down about this just insane radicalized nonsense that has grown out of COVID into this kind of new TSA, threatens to sort of install itself as this new regime. And what James is saying about having a personal life is I think crucially important, because what was the major dividing line for people throughout COVID, right? I mean, it wasn't Republican or Democrat. For all our talk about partisanship or whatever, people have switched sides. A lot of people I know have switched, have defected from whatever position they were previously on the basis of whether or not they wanted ultimately to be allowed to go back to their normal life, right? I mean, really what people chafe at with these lockdowns is that they want to be in church. They want to be watching their kids in school. They want to be meeting one another and being in person. And there was a whole segment of people, it turned out, who not only didn't care if they never got those things back, but actively seemed to feel that it was unethical to desire them or to value them above certain other things, right? They genuinely, there is a group of people who feel that not only can they upload all of their activities to the cloud without any loss of meaning or purpose, but you should be able to as well. And if you don't have that attitude about your life, then something's wrong with you, which speaks, I think, to a deep, deep level of kind of alienation from the basics of the human experience. And, the digital revolution, as James has elucidated very clearly, like does kind of bring that on in people. And there's a difference now, I think, between people who want to find some way of recovering the kind of embodied given experience of being human because they like it and because it has richness and meaning to them and ultimately, speaks of some higher purpose. Doesn't have to be Christianity, but does have to be spiritual and theological in some way. And then people who just think that all of that is basically hokum or some form of superstition. And so, for you to infringe upon their safety in any sort of way, in the name of something that they think is a complete fantasy, right? That makes you the bad guy. And I do think that like the DeSantis model of simply saying, do you know what? Like I'm going to kind of be a shield between that just steamroller of the regime that wants to unmake your life because it doesn't see it as worth anything, and you, so that you can go about the business of actually having that life, right? That's a winning message for people who have and want to have that kind of life. And, we'll see in the coming years just how many of those people there are. Speaking of COVID, we're looking at a new gathering kind of fight over this. We've been covering this too for quite some time. It's only escalating. We've got Los Angeles now talking about a vaccine mandate, just as New York has kind of installed. And one of the most remarkable parts of it all for me is the kind of scattershot way that these new kind of lockdown round 2, or whatever you want to call it, coronavirus round 2, Delta variant edition. I mentioned this a little bit last week, and it's only become more true that it really depends not just what state you're in, but like what neighborhood of what city you're in, what the relationship is between these grand, terrifying Fauci-esque pronouncements and your actual experience of day-to-day life. I mean, here in Tennessee, we're having like people are mobbing the school boards trying to get the schools open. And over in Texas, Matt, I know Abbott has basically said no more of these mandates in schools. And yet, we were talking before the show about the fact that some of the big blue cities are basically planning to just flout that, and it doesn't look like they'll get a lot of resistance. So this is another area in which it just seems as if chaos kind of reigns and nobody really knows who's in charge. Are you guys quantum pilled about this one too? I mean, what is lockdown part 2 or COVID wars part 2 looking like where you are?
Well, we're instituting vaccine passports pretty soon, supposedly. Like
Right.
You're going to have to demonstrate vaccination to get into a restaurant or a gym or, any place eventually, except, of course, homeless shelters. I don't know. I mean, people don't really seem that excited about it, but I haven't really seen tremendous amount of active resistance necessarily. I don't really know what's going to happen. I mean, at the same time, yeah, technically, if you go to a restaurant, they're supposed to check your temperature, but that doesn't seem to really be very common. I don't see a lot of appetite for resumption of lockdown, masks, or any of this. Even your typical just, liberal New Yorker types don't seem to be excited to start wearing masks again. So it remains to be seen how this is all going to work out.
Isn't it? I mean, it's strange how they. It's not strange. I mean, you just tell there's an overwhelming urge and momentum. It's the narrative is supposed to be, we lock the hell down again, and we pin the tail on the elephant, and half the country we use this as a wedge to get anyone who refuses to vax out of the military, to use as a way to punish the people we fear, like Ron DeSantis, and say he's killing grandma again. And you can see that whole desire. The problem is, it doesn't seem like the facts move in that direction. But that's why I'm wondering how far they'll go. I mean, Newsom is a good example of this as well. I think it's clearly not in his interest, if he wants to keep his seat in the governorship, to be pushing for lockdowns going right into fall, into the vote in September. On the other hand, this is the path they've chosen. So you see this kind of like lockstep, like they can't stop themselves from pushing, even as a lot of their own people are not really about this in the cities. But I say all that, and I listen hear what Seth is saying. At the same time, I see COVID hysteria washing over the nation again. I see people getting very freaked out about the variant, and there's not a lot of good data of any kind. And it is. I think I agree with I agree with you, Spencer. It's just a complete mess, and it's going to remain so.
Yeah, the appetite factor that Seth was describing does strike me as really important. I mean, it's not just fatigue, I don't think. I mean, there's a high amount of that, just in part because our grand overlords have a tendency to like vastly understate the amount of time that they expect us to be doing any one of these things. I mean, we all remember 15 days to slow the spread, but it's more than that, right? It's the complete paucity of reliable data. It's the fact that every time somebody meaningfully challenges like the mask mandates or the lockdowns or whatever, the goalposts then suddenly shift so that now we're talking about cases instead of deaths, and we all have to get vaccinated, but also, the CDC has changed its mind about whether that means you should or shouldn't put a mask on, right? I mean, and we were talking last week about the fact that they kind of need this to work now. Like Biden, I don't think can really stand to have this just like fall, a kind of lockdown part 2 fall on its face, and the country can't stand to go through another lockdown. Even like, doesn't matter how blue you are, like you can't just shut down your economy a second time. And I'm hearing from people, I mean, this is purely anecdotal, but I'm hearing from people who I would never have expected to hear it from, that this is just, enough is enough. Like it's absurd to have these kids under, wearing masks and whatever. And I, for a long time, have been coming around to sort of feeling like the actual reality of where this thing is going to go is that, like, we're going to have a sort of, a regular sort of lifelong experience of coronavirus existing in our lives. And there will probably be a number of variants, and everybody will probably get it a fair few times, and you'll get different kinds of vaccines. It's like the flu. We have this thing that we do with the flu where there's a vaccine available. If the politics weren't on the table, this would be a kind of quite straightforward. There would be a quite straightforward road from here to coronavirus looking and acting a lot like the flu. You have a vaccine. It comes around every year. You figure out how you want to manage your life, and sort of layered on top of that is this just totally arabesque form of like entrenchment and anger, and it does seem to me to play right into the ruling class's hands, because then they can kind of like make a big noise about it. They can do mail-in ballots, as I'm sure they will do en masse in California. But I feel a certain weariness, not just in my own bones, but from the people that I would not expect to be kind of done with this. Even though, of course, there are the COVID police officers and all that. I'm also hearing a lot of people just kind of throw up their hands and want to get on with their lives.
So the question there is, I mean, how far does that go? I do have that sense. It's clear, at least whatever it means politically, that I think personally, there are a hell of a lot of people who, now that Trump's out of the picture, who are, lean on the D column and lean into the D column, and they're not happy with this either. I suspect, and I've thought this for a while, you just forget logic and reason in the midst of the madness you have to look at every horrific day. Someone needs to just stand up and say, we're never going to get rid of this. It doesn't go away. It's a virus. It'll be here. We mitigate it like the flu as time goes on, but this is not going away. And, there's no sensible talk of its origins. There's no sensible talk of how it came to be. And there's no sensible end game. And until a politician is able to say that out loud to the American people, like, look, it's not going to go away. You can't have zero COVID. You're going to have to live with it. But we live with a lot of things like this. And, we've taken some steps, and yet just speak in a sensible way. Until that happens, it's exactly, this is where this goes. If left unchecked is clear. Increasingly, you're going to be forcing people to inject things into their bodies that large-scale corporations and the government want them to, in response to basically anything, given the risk analysis when you look at it right now, like what they're talking about with the kids in schools. This is utterly insane. And I mean, until you get politicians who can stand up and kind of say some sensible things so people can actually just frame it right, this is never ending. I mean, this is just a new public health regime that has no reason to stop, and will get worse.
Yeah, what's funny is, who is saying that increasingly, at least in my orbit, Matt, is actual scientists, like people who have a genuine, just kind of like, remember when there were people who had a sort of academic interest and curiosity in finding out the truth about physical science? Like I do, and there are still some of those people around, and they for a while have been saying, yeah, like that's what this is, and there's like a huge amount of denial about it, which will probably just lead the relevant characters to like dig in their heels and pretend that they were right all along. But also, and I guess we'll end again on a quantum pilled note. It also seems as if like there's enough common sense left in the common man to sort of be like, well, eventually somebody's just got to say this. Well, we hope we have quantum pilled you all thoroughly. I remain in the state. This is like the most helpful concept, Seth, that I've had in a while. I remain in a state of quantum uncertainty about the state of the country, but I'm very glad to be here with you guys talking about it. Thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about our projects and writing, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewofbooks.com, and our brand new Washington, D.C. based Center for the American Way of Life, dc.claremont.org. Don't forget to rate, share, subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast. Be aware that our Substack, American Mindset, is ceasing production of regular content and will be porting over to americanmind.org. You'll still get all the good stuff, all the Tell Me What You Really Thinks, all the essays from us, but it'll be on the main site, americanmind.org. Thanks to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee, and thank you all for listening. Talk to you next week.